So I think one question that needs to be answered because it often comes up in debates is what was the biggest genocide in history? And no, Marvel nerds, Thanos doesn't count. And I know Wikipedia would say you can help by expanding this list, but please, everyone, don't go out and do that. So, what was the biggest genocide in history in terms of the loss of life and the overall death toll? It's a tricky question to answer because you have to often ask the question what constitutes a single genocide, especially when there are a series of related genocides that occur in close proximity to one another, whether in terms of the geography or in terms of the ideology that motivated them or in terms of when they happened. So it's very tricky to define sometimes what constitutes a singular genocide. And also, we're talking strictly in terms of death toll because there are other atrocities that there are other criteria through which an atrocity can be measured. Like, for instance, if you're talking about the greatest atrocity in human history in terms of the loss of knowledge, it might be the burning of the Library of Alexandria. And if you're talking about the greatest atrocity in human history in terms of the loss of architectural value, I would argue that the Allies and the Russians in World War II would be the biggest culprits there. So, I'm talking in terms of simply loss of life. From that perspective, I think there are basically 7 potential candidates. Firstly, the Nazis in World War II. All the genocides related to their campaign. And again, like this list is entirely like based on the biggest numbers given. It's not supposed to be an objective analysis of what the actual numbers were for any of these genocides. It's just, I'm just trying to create a short list of what are the genocides that have been accused of having the biggest numbers and trying to figure out from that if we can ascertain which one has the biggest, or at least which one is accused of having the biggest. So firstly, the Nazis, who have been accused of, in terms of civilians murdered, anywhere between 6 to 20 million, I think. Secondly, communism. Again, this could be subdivided into multiple genocides because you have the Red Terror, the Holodomor, the Great Leap Forward, the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. And in total, communism throughout the 20th century has been accused of killing anywhere between 10 million to like 100 million people. The statistics vary extremely wildly. And again, there's a question, because these were committed by different regimes, can you categorize them as one interrelated set of genocides or not? But there's that. So number 2 is communism. Number 3, the Atlantic slave trade. This gets into tricky territory because it raises the question, is something a genocide if the intention is not to kill the people, but instead to enslave them? I don't know if there's an objective answer to that question, but because of the sheer number of people who were enslaved, and the fact that, yes, many of them did die as slaves, although, again, it raises the question, okay, they would have died eventually anyway, so does it count as genocide if their lifespan was shortened by being a slave? And was it shortened? That's another question, because did the average slave live longer than the average person in Africa? Yes or no? I don't know the answer to that question. And does a life of forcible servitude, is that equivalent to death? Is it better than death? Is it worse than death? Does it constitute a genocide? Again, these are questions. I don't have the answers. But I think it merits inclusion in the list. So, the Atlantic slave trade. And that, the number of people from Africa who were enslaved in the Atlantic slave trade, I don't know what the exact number was. I've heard hundreds of millions. I've heard numbers less than 100 million. I don't know. Number 4, the conquest of the Americas. Again, this gets into tricky territory because we don't know how many people died. We don't know how many were the result of deliberate genocide versus accidental or incidental transmission of disease. But again, the number, it could be in the over 100 million in total if you count people who died of disease. And again, there's the question of how much of that was deliberate or accidental. But I think it's also a candidate. So that's 4. Number 5, the spread of Islam. So this includes, again, these are related instances. Although, to be fair, you could say the same for the Atlantic slave trade because that was carried out by multiple countries as well. Same with the colonization of the Americas. So again, okay, the spread of Islam. So that includes the genocides committed by Tamerlane, the Mughals, with the spread of Islam into the Indian subcontinent. It would include the deaths that came from the spread of Islam into North Africa and Europe. In total, I have no idea how many. Some people have said in the tens of millions. So it could definitely also be a high number that merits consideration here. Basically, anything that's been accused of being over 10 million, I'm putting in the list. Okay, so there's that. Number 6, various civil wars within China. Again, like, how do you define war versus genocide? It's a tough question. It's not an easy question to answer, but some of these wars in China have had absurdly high death tolls, like I think comparable to World War II even. So I think some of these Chinese civil wars, and I'm not even counting communism and the Great Leap Forward here. I'm talking about like earlier civil wars within China. So that's another thing to take into consideration. So that's number 6. Number 7 is the genocides committed by the Japanese in World War II. Again, like some people would say this should be categorized together with genocides committed by the National Socialists because they were allied together. I don't know the exact numbers, how many the Japanese killed, but again, they've been accused of killing in excess of 10 million people, so that could also enter into the list. So those, I think, are the 7 candidates. Again, like, I mean, whether you want to view this as, you know, who's the worst in history or whatever, I mean, you could view it whatever way you want. But I think the bottom line is this is a topic that comes up in a lot of debates. And a lot of people speak as if they're definitively certain that one of these was the biggest, usually based on, you know, their own ideology. So, like, if people really oppose communism, they'll be like, well, it was obviously the communists who killed the most people. Or if people really oppose fascism, they'll say, oh, it was obviously the Nazis who killed the most people. A lot of blacks will say, oh, the Atlantic slave trade was obviously the worst atrocity in history. A lot of Jews will say it was obviously the Holocaust. A lot of Native Americans will say it was obviously the conquest of the Americas. Truth is, I can't definitively answer which had the worst death toll, nor can I answer the question of whether the death toll is the sole measure of what was ultimately the worst atrocity. Because there's other factors, you know, other than just the sheer death toll. There's the motivations, the question of how much of it was deliberate. There's also the question of other consequences aside from death toll. And there's the question of who counts as a victim. There's a lot of questions here. I don't think it can be necessarily answered definitively. But I think, at very least, it needs to be asked. So that's my opinions on that.